that religion is necessary to form the character of the people. So religion, in creating good Christians, created good citizens and was therefore necessary for political prosperity.
For most Americans, though, one phrase comes to mind when they think of the founders' views on religion: the wall of separation between church and state. But as we've seen, this language is not in the First Amendment, or for that matter, any of the founding documents of the United States. So where is it? Those words actually come from the third president, Thomas Jefferson. Though known as the most skeptical of the founders, Jefferson actually attended Sunday church services in the House of Representatives while he was president. On New Year's Day, 1802, he sat down to write a letter to a group of Baptist supporters in Connecticut, reaffirming his commitment to religious liberty.
In his letter to the Baptists, he quotes from the First Amendment and then ends with a comma and says, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. This was a letter written on January 1, 1802.
An elegant metaphor, but ignored for much of America's history. It would be almost 150 years before those words would become fighting words. When we come back, the wall of separation really gets built in modern America. America's founders saw religious liberty as a cornerstone of the Republic. They guaranteed it in the First Amendment. No religion would be imposed on anyone, and all faiths would be protected. For the next 170 years, these principles were rarely questioned. Then, in 1947, the Supreme Court turned them on their head and found a new guarantee in the Constitution of freedom, in effect, from religion. It began with an argument over bus fare in Ewing Township, New Jersey.
This was a controversy that involved a state law in New Jersey that reimbursed parents for the expense of transporting their children to and from parochial schools, that is to say, religious schools.
More specifically, Catholic schools. A group opposed to the law filed suit, and the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where it became known as Everson versus Board of Education. In a 5-4 majority opinion, Justice Hugo Black explained that the bus fare reimbursements were in fact constitutional. But Black would later suggest that for the Catholics, Everson was a Pyrrhic victory, a battle won at far too great a cost. For within the opinion, Black included sweeping language that would launch a battle over religious expression that still rages some 50 years later. Everson was a product of a changing religious landscape in America.
From what we might call the colonial period and up through the Civil War, the United States was, without a doubt, an overwhelmingly Protestant nation. Beginning in the late 19th century, we start to see immigration on a more massive scale coming from Western and Eastern Europe. So a combination of things produced kind of a backlash among some elements of Protestant America.
Especially against Catholics.
There's a concern that perhaps the Catholic community is getting too strong. Remember, the name of the organization that we go by today, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, what was it founded as? Protestants and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State. It was an expressly anti-Catholic organization.
The main division in the country was what you would call mainline Protestant groups, and the Catholic hierarchy pushing very strongly for subsidies for its educational community, and that's helped spark the creation of our organization.
Americans United soon became part of a growing movement championing a new divide between church and state, led by other groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union. Their joint strategy came from an unlikely place, the struggle for racial equality.
In the 1930s, the NAACP developed a concerted plan to challenge public school segregation. And one of the things the NAACP taught many other public interest groups was if people on the outside of the political process, that is, those who are minorities, could use the courts to advance a constitutional claim, then why couldn't they do it as well?
When the Everson bus fare controversy broke out in New Jersey, the ACLU quickly jumped in to help lead the fight.
The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, filed what's known as an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief in this case. And they invoke this Jeffersonian letter in which he uses the wall of separation metaphor. And there are some striking similarities between the way in which the ACLU discussed the topic using a historical approach and the language used by the Supreme Court of the United States.
As we've seen, that language was written by Justice Hugo Black. Black was no legal scholar, but a former U.S. Senator from Alabama with a controversial past.
Hugo Black was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. The group he hated most was not blacks or Jews, it was Roman Catholics.
There have been those who've alleged that it was blacks' disapproval, perhaps even disdain for Roman Catholicism in American society, that was very much a motivating factor when blacks spoke of the necessity for a high and impregnable wall of separation.
Whatever his motivations, Black's language in the Everson opinion was sweeping. For the first time, he said the First Amendment's Establishment Clause applied not just to the federal government, but also to the states, and he offered up a new concept of its intent: to erect a Jeffersonian wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable, he wrote. We could not approve the slightest breach.
For Hugo Black, there were not a lot of gray areas. Black was not a on the one hand, on the other hand guy. And if the Establishment Clause says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, no meant no.
Black was even more specific. No setting up a church, no coercion in matters of religion, no laws to aid religion, and no taxes to support religion. But some scholars say Black got his history wrong.
First, he misunderstands the original purposes of the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause was a statement of federalism or a statement of jurisdiction. The second error, Black read Madison and Jefferson to require, he said, no tax in any amount in any way can go to favor religion. In practice, that actually requires discrimination against religion. If you have a program with general funding, religious groups can't participate. Madison and Jefferson, especially Madison, never wanted religious discrimination. So Justice Black, in essence, was rewriting the First Amendment in 1947.
The Everson decision paved the way for the first real victory for the ACLU and its allies. In 1948, an atheist activist named Vashti McCollum launched a challenge to the practice of release time at her son's school in Illinois. The practice allowed students to voluntarily receive religious instruction after school hours, and McCollum wanted it abolished.
This time the court took the language that Black had used in Everson, but this time actually used that language to reach a conclusion that handed the first major victory to the separationist bar.
The separationists were soon on a roll. In 1962, the Supreme Court banned school prayer. In 1963, it prohibited Bible reading in the classroom. And in 1971, it cut off government funding for religious schools. Each case set precedents that echo through the courts today.
One of the unfortunate consequences of the Everson decision and the cases that followed is that there is this perception that nothing of a religious nature must be tolerated in the public sphere. Clearly, that was not the vision of the American founders, and clearly that is not mandated by the explicit text of the First Amendment.
When we come back, the modern-day war over religion. In 1947, the Supreme Court cited a little-known phrase by Thomas Jefferson to create the principle that the Constitution required a wall of separation between church and state. That innovation started what some see now as an all-out war against religion in American public life. It began by driving out religious instruction from public schools and cutting off